So one way to look at a country's fiscal challenges is to do this fiscal gap analysis, which is a partial equilibrium analysis. You're projecting tax receipts, you're projecting expenditures, assuming the macroeconomy is what it is, or what it's projected to be, but there's no feedback through time of the fiscal policy on the macroeconomy and the macroeconomy on the fiscal conditions. There's no interaction here. So another way to think about fiscal sustainability is to have a model where the government's intertemporal budget constraint is actually satisfied, but you engage in a policy where through time, at least for a long time, you are engaging in a take-as-you-go, taking from the young, giving to the old, seeing what happens, and then at some point things stabilize to, or you have a take-as-you-go policy that's, let's say, a fixed taking rate, so that's already stable or stationary, but because of the demographics, it becomes a bigger burden, fiscal burden through time when you have society aging. So back in 1979, I started, well, let me go back even further. If you go back to when I started grad school, which was 1973, we had a dynamic model of the economy, which people were writing papers using. It was a life cycle model. Remember I said that the life cycle model is kind of the relevant model because people are not altruistic, at least in our country. I think in most countries, they really don't love their children economically speaking. So, and the kids don't love the parents economically speaking. It goes both ways. So the models back then were two-period because that's the only thing you could use that you could solve. You could use some kind of calculation machine or a computer. We had primitive computers. The computer I used for my thesis was about the size of this room. And I typed out my code on cards. There was a card reader that somehow sent messages to the computer. So you could, in very simple two-period models, you could figure out where the economy was going to go. Because if you knew the initial condition right now, for example, the capital stock, you could figure out what the capital stock would be next period using this first order nonlinear difference equation that related capital today in a nonlinear manner to capital tomorrow. And then once you had capital tomorrow, you could plug it in to that equation for capital today. That could be capital today because tomorrow it will be capital today, and get capital the next period. And just keep going through that and find out where the economy was going to go. That was the state of the art. And people then were starting to simulate economies where people live for many periods, not just two periods. So you had then nonlinear difference equations that were of higher order. But nobody had any technique. So for example, if you assume people live as adults for 90 years, well, that's actually in our model here we have 70 years, so from 20 to 90. Then we're talking about, when you really write it down, it might be about a 225th order nonlinear difference equation. Pretty complicated. So people could write down very simplified versions of such a big model, and they couldn't solve the transition path because there's no known technique for solving, mathematicians don't have any technique for solving exactly the transition path of an economy that's that complicated. They don't have techniques for solving nonlinear difference equations except to approximate them with linear difference equations, differential equations. So what do? Well, one thing you do is you ignore the transition and you just focus on the long run where all the capital values, capital stocks if you like, are the same. And that's what James Tobin did in a paper that was well known at the time, where he looked at a life cycle economy in the steady state. So people, when I was in grad school, I started in 1973, so, you know, I think Tobin wrote his paper probably around 73. People started writing steady state papers. I wrote one for my thesis. As part of my thesis, I looked at a steady state model, because that was the only thing you could solve easily on the computer. Now, how did you do it? Even there, you've got basically like a single equation with this k bar, but it's highly nonlinear. But it's one equation and one unknown. You know, you got lots and lots of terms. Well, you try a value, and you see whether the value you plug into this very, you know, complicated formula. If you have a formula that says a k equals some complicated function of k, well, you plug in k and you see what you come back with. If you come back with k, you've got the right answer. If you come back with something that's not k, well, then you could take a weighted average of your initial guess and the new guess and plug that in and see if that came back with something that you put in, with what you put in. So you can do this, what's called Gauss-Seidel iteration. There's no guarantee that this will work, but in practice it does work. And you can therefore solve for the steady state. So as of like 1979 or so, maybe 1980, we were able to solve steady states using this technique, but we weren't able to solve the transition path. We didn't know how long it was going to take to get to the steady state. Obviously, you never really get to the steady state. That's an asymptotic thing you get to. You get there closer, you get closer and closer to it. But how long does it take to get halfway to the steady state, to where the thing is going to end up? Well, in infinite time. So if you have some fiscal policy, what's the impact through time, and how does it affect the different generations along the way? Nobody could solve that problem. And so this was the life cycle model. This was the standard model of economics. It's the right model because it's one in which people are not altruistic. You can incorporate liquidity constraints. This doesn't have that, but people have been able to incorporate those. So you can incorporate a lot of things. So here we have the basic model of economics, basic macro model, and where I'm even leaving out uncertainty that can't be solved. So we really can't say anything whatsoever about fiscal policy's impact really at all. And we can't say anything about the interaction of how the macroeconomy is going to be affected by fiscal policy at all. Basically, we were out of business back in 1979. So I was asked to write a paper for a conference on simulation methodology by Martin Feldstein. And I asked Alan Auerbach, who's a professor now at Berkeley, to write this paper with me. It was going to be he was asked also to write a paper. We decided we'll write one paper together, and it was going to be at a very fancy hotel called the Breakers in Florida. And so we had to write, and there's going to be a lot of famous economists like Joe Stiglitz there. And so we decided we would try and write a paper. So Alan, I was out teaching. I had graduated from graduate school at this point, and I was out teaching at UCLA, or on a postdoc at UCLA. And Alan came out for a week, and we spent a week figuring out that we had nothing to write about. And then at the end of, he had to leave on Saturday. On Friday, it dawned on me that we should try and solve the transition path using the same guessing game that we were using for the steady state, which is not guess one number, but guess the entire path of the capital stock, figure out from that, and also guess the labor supply path. From those supplies of factors, figure out what firms would be willing to pay for those factors, use the marginal product conditions to figure out the wage and interest rate path, take those guesses of the wage and interest rate paths, which are derived from guesses of the capital labor ratio path, and then ask the private household sector what they would consume and what they would spend and how much they would work every period. And that would produce new supplies of capital through time and new supplies of labor. And so we'd have a new set of capital, a new capital path and a new labor path, which we could then average out with the first guess of those paths and keep iterating over the path. And Alan thought this was not going to work. He said, no, it's not worth it. There's certainly no guarantee it would work. But I said, well, we don't have anything else, we're going to try it. And he kind of said, well, okay. And he had to go off back to Philadelphia. So I sat down with my computer, which, the machine was like this big, and it was like a big typewriter. And then you had a printer where the paper was coming out this big, and we were using a connection, a modem that was a huge modem like this and a huge telephone that sat in it. That was the nature of the technology. And we were using a Data Resources Incorporated. This was Otto Eckstein. That name is probably familiar to nobody here, but he was a famous Harvard economist who had worked on macroeconomic modeling, forecasting. So he had this company, and he gave Harvard professors free access to their computer. And that was like the largest computer around. Well, within a few days, we were using more of their computer than anybody else. And we were starting to change their billing rate, because it was how much they were billing their customers depended on how much we were using, how much was being used for research versus. So anyway, we were able to finish the study before they discovered this and threw us off their system. And then we went on to the Brookings Institution computer, and then they discovered we were messing. We were using too much of their time, and they threw us. Anyway, this is a side story, but we got the thing to work, and in a very simple version, and then we started to make it more and more elaborate through time. And I thought, well, this is hooray, we now can figure out the transition path. Hooray, I'll get tenure somewhere. And Alan thought this was good. He'd probably get tenure somewhere. So I proceeded then to get fired by UCLA. Then I went to Yale. I was hired by Yale. Tobin, who I thought would like this a lot, I presented this in the first week I'm at Yale. He says, you can't solve this problem. I think he had probably wanted to solve this problem, hadn't thought of this technique, and which is very close to his technique. And we cited him, of course. But he said, no, you absolutely can't solve it. So we're on a seminar, first week, new associate professor, not tenured. He claims it can't be done. Big back and forth. Other people, other senior members of the faculty, they just hired me. I thought because of this work, which had been published, which some people thought was really good, I thought, well, gee, why did they hire me? But he didn't like it, and the other people, he didn't think it could be done. The other senior members of the faculty there said that, well, Jim, you're wrong. Larry's wrong for a different reason. So anyway, it took me quite a while to figure out how to convince these guys that this actually works. I finally did. But then I got fired from Yale a couple years later. So just to show you that you can succeed and not succeed in this business. But anyway, I ended up at BU, and at some point, after about 12 years, we were ranked higher than Yale, so I felt good, because we ended up building up our department. So that was okay. There was a little bit of retribution. Anyway, over time, what we've done is taken this model and added things to it. So we've added children. So we have people having utility for their own utility. I'm going to show you with a paper rather than just talking to you. And this paper is joint with all these folks, a couple of my grad students at BU and some economists at the Guidar Institute. It's taken us about a year or so to add Russia to this model. The model at this point includes Russia, China, India, Japan plus Korea as a region, the European Union, and the US. So it's a 6-region model. And the way the paper works, here's the timeline. Parents have utility for their own consumption and leisure when they're adults, which is between 21 and 90. They die for sure at 90. Between 0 and 21, they're kids. So parents have utility for themselves and also for their kids when they're up through age 21. And so between 23 and 66, you have kids and raise them, and then you can start to die here at 68, and at 90 you're dead for sure. So death is random, so there's some idiosyncratic risk to when you're going to die, mortality risk. And people leave bequests to their kids, not because they love their kids, it's because they don't have full annuitization of their resources. So they die with some money that they hope to be spending in the future, but they die, if you like, unexpectedly, and they leave that to their kids. So there's bequests in this model. And then another key factor in this model feature is how we treat sex. We have no sex in this model. This is not a sexy model. This is a model without, with monozygotic reproduction. So each agent gives birth to, by himself or herself, to children. Now, in the real world, the way you get a realistic distribution of the population by age is you have some people, different people marrying at different ages. Let's just take a society where people marry, or at least getting together. In Iceland, only 10% get married. In the US, about pretty high fraction get married, and then of course they get divorced with a 52% rate. So,
in a year.
What?
In a year.
Yeah, over time. And the divorce rate on the second marriage is even higher. It's like 60%. On the third marriage, it's even higher. So the ones who nobody ever learns from this. So anyway, the way so let's take a case where people get together, and some people have no kids. Some people have 3 kids at different ages. Some people have 2 kids. And this is how you get a distribution of the population by age. If everybody had kids just when they hit 23, then we would have a very different looking age distribution of the population. So we don't want to carry in our model this marriage business and who's going to have kids and who's not, because that would make the model very complicated. So the way a grad student, Jan Walliser, suggested we fix this, which is I think a brilliant, I loved it, idea, and we implement it here, is that you give birth to fractions of kids. So Michael here, when you're 23, you might give birth to 2% of a kid, okay? And when you're 23, it might be 2.1% of a kid. And so there's a pattern of births by age, which corresponds to the fertility, the number of births per child at a given age of a woman. We're replicating that pattern to calibrate the model. And in terms of the math, it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a 20% of a kid or a 2% of a kid. It's just an agent. So that's just a kind of a scaling issue. So the model works fine, and as you'll see, we're really good at replicating the age distribution of the population. We're also trying to get to the total population numbers. We're trying to get those on target for the different countries. We have projections from the UN and also from Rostat, in the case of Russia, out through 2050. What we assume after 2058, which is 75 years after our model begins, which is beginning in 2013, is that births stabilize, that each cohort that comes along has at a given age has the same number of births as the cohort that, as the age group the year before. So we get a stabilization of births, and eventually that leads to a stable population, a fixed, a zero population growth long run, where the population is stabilized. And this assumption involves a slowly changing fertility rate, turns out. So in the case of Russia, for example, the assumption is we're basically following the Rostat projections on fertility up through about the middle of the century, and then we have this assumption which involves the fertility rate rising even further, and that plus the immigration rate eventually leads to zero population growth. So we have a long-run steady state that has a stable distribution, a stable age distribution and a stable population sizes for all the regions. And that's the demographic transition. We also have people, as I said, dying stochastically between 68 and 90, and we have these mortality rates changing through time. Younger cohorts live longer, so their mortality rates at younger ages are smaller. Again, that's based on projections. So we're trying to really follow all the elements of the demographic projections as closely as possible to see if we can line up. Now I want to show you what a great job, one of the really interesting things of this study is what it tells you about the demographics. And I have to now go to the whole, oh, well, I'll talk to you about the rest of the model in a second. Okay, so here we have our demographic projections, and what you can see here is that in the top row is 20, let's look at the US. We're projecting, the actual data is that there's 319.9 million people in the US right now. As I speak, we've got about 320 million people. Our model has about 320 million people, right in, well, 2013. We're almost exactly on the nose. In 2050, our model says there's going to be 403 million people. The data, the official projection is 401 million people. So that's really close. Now, think about that. That's adding something like 80 million people. How many people does the Philippines have right now? What's the population of the Philippines? It's about 80 million people. Suppose we took every Filipino and airlifted them and helicoptered them down into, or parachuted them down into the US in the places where people are now. We would have a massive increase in the population instantly, also massive crowding, all kinds of issues and problems. The US is experiencing a population explosion. Nobody seems to be paying any attention to this. It's in large part due to the immigration rate. And we're not at all preparing for it. We're just bringing people in left, right, and center, and without any planning of new cities, without any planning of infrastructure, transportation. So if you've ever driven in Manila in a taxi cab from the airport to a mile away to a hotel, how long does it take? It takes about 3 hours. It's just, that's okay with me. that might be more musical than my talk. I think it is. So, how big is the Russian population right now? It's 143 million people. So we're talking
plus 2 million.
What?
Plus 2 million.
Plus 2 million. Yeah. Yeah. So we're talking about the US increasing its population by roughly about 2/3 of the current Russian population. Meanwhile, the Russian population is projected to decline through 2057 by about 13 million people. And you can see we're doing pretty well matching up with the official projections for all these countries. India is going to expand by about 300 million people. China is going to pretty much stay even. Japan's going to contract by about 20 million people. EU is not going to change much. And then we have projections. Well, let me just show you the age distribution. If you look at the the data and the model, the data and the model, the data and the model, the data and the model. You see these numbers are all very close together. This is like the share of people initially in 2013 in these age ranges. So the model's doing really well. It took a long time to calibrate the model to get all this to work out so nicely. So I think we got the demographics down quite well. And then, you know, just for example, if we look at the Japanese, the fraction of people right now between 70 and 90, the data say 15.26, we say 15.22. In 2050, the data say, or the official projection by the UN is 29.4, we're 28.6. You really can't do better than this, I don't think, in this kind of model. Now, what about after 2050? Well, Russia's population ends up at 98. We don't have any projections, official projections, so we're just relying on the model, but Russia's population is now 90, basically down 44 million people from where it is today. Meanwhile, the US has gone up by another 42 million. So the US has gone up by about the size of the Russian population. Over the century, we add the Russia's population, and Russia loses basically about a third of its population. And this is despite the fact that we're assuming that the fertility rate rises from 1.64 in mid-century to 1.82. So it's not like we're assuming declining fertility. We're assuming the opposite. So that makes for a very different world. Look at Japan. Their population is 106 million at the end of the century. They're down 70 million people. It's going to be a lot easier to get around in Tokyo at the end of the century. There's all kinds of interesting geopolitical considerations here. How can you know, how big is your GDP going to be? And how big can your military be, et cetera, if you're shrinking by 70 million people in your Japan. So some interesting questions. And here you see the age distribution. And I can't go through all the numbers here, but let me tell you about how we model production. We've got a Cobb-Douglas production function for output and capital labor, and then we also have an energy sector, which is modeled as simply as possible, which is just an endowment flow. Yep. Energy sector.
How do you model it?
Just as an extra endowment flow. The country's got this, you know, flow of corn, if you like. We call it energy. And it stops after 75 years for each country. Russia's got a much bigger endowment as a share of the world endowment, which is, you know, calibrated again based on proven reserves. And so here, Russia's government is getting a big chunk of its revenue in the model from this energy endowment, which stops in 75 years. And what do you think happens then? Problem, because a source of revenue has gone down, and so then tax rates have to rise. The US has got its own problems. It has to do with aging and taxes that are going to have to be increased to deal with aging. In Russia and the other countries, the assumption is that there's a productivity catch-up, so that each new cohort of 21-year-old Russians gets closer and closer to the productivity of 21-year-old Americans. And that over a certain period of time, like 25 years, the latest cohort is equally as productive. In China, there's also a catch-up period. In India, a catch-up period, but it takes longer. We're assuming a longer catch-up. European Union, a catch-up period. Japan. So we're looking at per capita GDP and then thinking about catch-up time. So there's that aspect here. And that's a good thing for these countries that are running into other problems because they're becoming more productive in the model. We also have an underlying productivity growth, which is 1%, technological change. Now, it's important we need to figure out where the economy is going to go in order to simulate this transition, because we need to basically tie down the end. We need to have terminal conditions, if you like, to help us solve this 250th order nonlinear difference equation. We only have one initial condition, which is the capital stock, so we need to have some terminal conditions, and basically we need to figure out where the economy is going to end up. Or at least know that at some point it's going to start leveling off, and assume that after, let's say, 300 years, it's exactly, the future is going to be the same as it is at 300 years. And then we can test to see whether that 300-year assumption is going to change anything up to that point, and it doesn't. So the productivity growth, in order to get a steady state, you can't use labor augmenting technological change, because there are features of this utility function, which is called a CES, constant elasticity of substitution utility function, which don't permit it to reach a steady state if there's labor augmenting technological change. And there's also, part of this is that people are valuing leisure, and at some point they retire endogenously. They'd like to make their leisure actually more than one, which is their endowment of time. But there's what are called shadow wages in here that keep them from doing that, so that we can solve for that constraint. We basically incorporate the constraint that you can't sleep more than 100% of your day. I think leisure is a form of sleeping. If you're not working on economics, you're engaged in leisure, and therefore sleeping. Small joke. Okay, just to try and keep a little bit awake here. So we have to come up with a different way to get technological change, and the way we put it in is by augmenting the time endowment of each cohort that comes along by 1%. So young people are, if you're a year younger than me, you're 1% more efficient in your use of time, both for leisure purposes and also for producing output. You have 1% more time. So technological change becomes like a higher population growth rate, if you like. Anyway, that works as a, and then we also have an age wage profile, so that you become more efficient as you age. So we're trying to get all these realistic elements: an age wage profile that rises as you age and peaks. There's a kind of a shape like this that we see in the real data. Some underlying technological change, and then some catch-up productivity growth. All that's in this model. We have people then dying randomly. The money they leave goes to their kids, and the kids then take that money and save it. Some of it they save, some they spend, and all that is incorporated. Now, so we simulate this thing. How do we know? And also there's a price of energy, which gets determined endogenously. And then we can basically simulate a decline in the price of energy by just reducing the endowment by like 50%. We can say, what if energy prices do what they've just done, which is fall by 50% and stay low for a long time? What happens? How does Russia get affected? How does its fiscal policy change? According to the model, how much do the tax rates have to rise immediately and through time to sustain its spending? So that's the kind of question you can answer in this model. Okay, so let me show you some well, let me say one other thing, which is about the basic framework. So I tell you about all this stuff. I tell you about all the different complexities of it. It sounds like it's got a lot. It's taken, this is building this model from 1979 till today. We've had a lot of people working on it, Germans. This particular type of model has been used by people around the world, but my use of the model has gotten to this point. We've also had, with some German co-authors, a version of this model where there's traded and non-traded goods. We have 6 goods, 3 traded, 3 non-traded, and we figured out a technique for figuring out endogenously what countries, what regions produce what goods at what point in time. That was no simple feat because comparative advantage is changing through time as the demographics change and capital is flowing freely, but not the labor across the countries. There's capital is mobile, but not labor. And therefore, you can get outside what's called the cone of diversification when it comes to your production of goods, and you can start specializing in particular goods and figuring out which countries are producing what goods at what in each year. We were able to do in a paper that we wrote, which I thought was going to automatically get accepted by a top journal. We sent it to the one top journal after the next, and what came back was, it's a big black box, and why don't you write a 2-period model? That's what the referee said. So we were a little bit shocked by that because I don't think you can get at any of these big questions unless you get the demographics right, unless you have lots of age groups because they all matter. Technological change, catch up. They wanted to have fewer elements in 2 periods. That's what the referees wanted. Because they basically didn't want to read this paper because they didn't trust the results. And why don't they trust the results? Because there's a lot of equations. There's probably 1 million variables here. Jim Heckman got very interested in this model. He asked me to come to there's an energy lab outside of Chicago. I forget the name of it. It's one of the US has, like Los Alamos, they have these big labs. And I went there to talk to the physicists and mathematicians who seem to have nothing else to do except maybe work on some economics models. So he said, maybe you could talk to these guys, get them interested. They could come up with some way to solve this thing much faster. I said, sure, I'd love to meet them. It's the Argonne Lab. Okay, I go to this vast complex outside of Chicago, not too far from center Chicago, all gated, military facility. And I said, well, the thing runs in about 20 minutes. It's not that big a deal to get it running faster. And he said, come on along. Maybe they can do it in 2 minutes. And I said, okay. So we have this long conversation about the model over breakfast and lunch. And then at the middle of the afternoon, they say, how many variables and how many unknowns do you have? Because we're going to think about the matrix and do a matrix inversion and see if we can use some Gauss, some kind of Newton-Raphson iteration method to solve this problem more rapidly. And I started adding it up. It turned out to be over 1 million equations, 1 million unknowns. They said goodbye. They said, we can't do this on our computer. Even we have the biggest computer in the country, we can't do it. So goodbye. And I said, okay, goodbye. And that was, so we have this big machine. How do you know it works? How can you tell it works? How can you tell the solution to any model works? Well, you can test that all the equations are being satisfied, every single one of them. You can test that everybody's on their budget constraint, that all the budget constraints are satisfied, that that supply and demand in the market for goods is satisfied, that the world supply of assets equals the world's demand for capital, that the demand for labor equals the demand for capital. It's easy to check that everything works. Also, if you have something not working, if one or more of these equations doesn't work, the model won't simulate. It won't converge. Trust me, I've been there. So actually, it's a black box, but you can actually figure out what's going on in this black box, and you can test it as working, and then try things just to get the intuition. The model can teach you things, here's what the model's taught us some things, some very interesting things about the transition that we can't figure out on our own. But there's a bunch of calibrated parameters, but you can read about those. And to start with, I'm not going to show you this table because first of all, it's going to hurt your necks to look at it sideways, or my neck. But it's basically saying that we're hitting in 2013 the right relative GDPs of the countries, the right saving rates of the countries, at the right level of government consumption relative to household consumption in the countries. And And then we're hitting the expenditures. We're calibrating basic on the expenditures like health expenditures and education expenditures and government purchases of goods and services, pensions, interest on debt. We're using a conventional nomenclature. Anyway, let's look at the basic simulation results. And these are kind of quite interesting because we want to see what happens over time. Remember, the population in Russia is declining. So you think that Russia's share of GDP in the world, yeah? Oh, yeah. All the numbers on GDP are relative to the US value, which is 1. We're indexing everything to the US value of GDP in 2013. Look at what happens. The US, because of this population growth, has a GDP at the end of the century that's 3.6 times higher. The EU has one that's 3.74 times higher. So the EU and the US are staying kind of together in line through time. Japan doesn't increase. Its GDP goes from 0.39 to 0.66. It doesn't increase by a factor of almost 4. It increases by a factor of less than 2. Japan's share of world GDP shrinks dramatically. Now look at China. Because of this catch-up productivity, not because of their demographics, but because they're going to catch up and they have so many people to catch up. By the way, the model's got skilled and unskilled labor in it, so you can look at what happens to wage inequality in the model too. You get China expanding by a factor of 9, its GDP. You get India expanding by a factor, looks like 20 or so. Russia expands by a factor of about 5. So Russia stays even with the US basically because of the catch-up productivity assumption. This very much depends on your educational system. If your education system improves, I don't know the quality of your education system. People have told me it's less than it used to be, less good than it used to be. I know our system in the US seems to, our educational system is at the elementary and high school level has lots of problems that we are paying our teachers at a level which is barely above subsistence. You know, if you had a couple part-time, if you could work 2 shifts at McDonald's, you make more than a teacher, basically. That's the reality. What we're paying a lot of the teachers. But here's the deal. In 2100, at the end of the century, China and India are the world economy. Their GDP in this world of 6 regions constitutes 2/3 of the world's GDP. The US becomes a small player in a big world. Think about what that means for military spending and policing the world and freedom around the world. All these questions come up. There's lots of other things going on here, but I want to, about labor supply and capital. Basically, but I want to focus your attention on tax rates. And there's wage taxes and pension taxes and consumption taxes. And here's the very interesting thing that really complements what I said in the first lecture, which is the tax rates in the US have to go up quite dramatically. So the wage tax rate goes from like 15% to 21%. The pension tax rate goes from like 9% to 16, 17%. The consumption tax doubles from 17 to 35%. That's a very big increase in the total effective tax rate on labor supply. Let me just see if I can come up with that table. And we're just talking about average tax rates. There's also marginal tax rates because the income tax in our country is progressive. So marginal tax rates go from about, for high-skilled people, from about 50% to 71%, low-skilled people about 48% to 75%. This may not work for us. because people may leave the formal sector and go work in the informal sector. We may not, if we included an informal sector in our model might not converge, which is the model's way of telling you that you're running an infeasible, unsustainable fiscal policy if it doesn't converge. Computers talk to you, and if you try things, I can try things in this computer that won't converge. If I push this US spending much harder, if I have like a higher growth rate of healthcare spending than we assume here, the model won't converge. So it's saying, in its way, this is an unsustainable policy. But what it's doing is telling us something very similar to what the fiscal gap accounting tells us, which is something major has to change, and it's not going to be very pleasant. Because people born in the future are facing tax rates in this model that are far higher than the average tax rate goes from 39% to 64%. EU, very big increase in average tax rates and marginal tax rates. Japan, interestingly, does not have big changes in its tax rates. That's a very strange, surprising finding. And it has to do with their age healthcare expenditure profile being quite flat, the fact that they've had a couple major pension reforms, and the fact that they're going to have so many old people that their consumption tax base is going to be quite large, and therefore they're going to be able to collect a lot of revenues from the consumption tax, and therefore the consumption tax rate doesn't have to go up. Indeed, yeah, as much. So you have in China, so Japan gets through this transition, although it becomes a lot older than the other countries. It's already older. Gets through the transition much easier than one would have expected. China does the same. India sees some very big tax hikes because India's population growth rate, fertility rate is coming down, and so they're getting older. And despite a lot of catch-up in productivity, they still end up with much higher tax rates than prevail today. And now, what about Russia? Well, Russia is also shown here to be having a rough transition, fiscally speaking. And the big problems really show up in terms of average tax rates. The big problems are after the middle of the century when in 75 years from the transition, we exhaust Russian oil reserves as well as other countries' oil reserves. So you see a big increase in tax rates, and then there's some more aging that goes on. So at the end of the century, some significant problems because of the loss of revenues from the energy sector, but not so much for quite a while. So it's challenging, but it's not as challenging immediately as in the US. Now, let's talk about an oil price shock. Let's see. Let me see if I've got, okay, so let's talk about Russia being hit by a, that's the baseline. Okay, here's the oil price shock for India. You get, if oil prices fall in half, and the way we again model that is by cutting the endowment of energy, the energy supply in effect by half, then what happens is that tax rates in Russia have to go up by about 10 percentage points right away, 8 percentage points right away to keep them from going up even higher in the future. If you respond to this problem by running, here's the price shock. This third column is the price shock with a deficit, running a deficit, just borrowing money or calling it borrowing for 10 years. Then the tax rates stay low for a while, but then they end up higher as you have to pay interest. If we use those words, we can use different words. So they end up permanently higher. So borrowing is no solution. In the long run, however, things look okay again. There's much higher taxes for a while, but in the long run, what happens is that Russians are poorer because they have to pay higher taxes. They work more, and these are the income effects coming into play. Income and substitution effects are running around here, and the income effects are generally stronger than the substitution effects in these models. So if you do something to make the country poorer, so they need higher tax rates, and therefore they can't, the household's income has in effect been reduced because they have to pay more taxes, they're going to respond by working more because of the income effect. The substitution effect will have them work less, but the income effect will dominate. And so eventually the long-run tax rate is not much different than it started out, than it would otherwise have been, but the transition is not so great. Borrowing isn't going to help the story. Now, what about some policies that can relieve the day for Russia? What if you just, starting with no price shock to oil, what if you just got rid of the corporate income tax? Well, the impact on the tax, that's this column right here, corporate tax reform. The impact on the tax path is not much different, but wages will increase quite a bit in Russia. Let me see if I can show you those. Well, let's look at GDP. Yeah, look at this. There's a pretty big increase in GDP. It's not a doubling of GDP in Russia. This is this column right here. This number is bigger than that number. This number is bigger than that number by maybe 10% or so. This number is bigger than that. So we're talking about like a 10% very quick increase in GDP because of this elimination of the corporate tax in Russia and a replacement, and then we're going to higher taxes on wages in this transition. So we're substituting from a corporate tax to a higher tax on wages. That might sound like a bad thing for workers, but capital comes in and wages go up because the workers have more capital to work with. So on balance, they're better off. So this is actually a good thing for Russian workers. And then another idea would be to have pension reform, which would be, if you look at, if you do a pension reform of the type I just discussed, pension reform gradually raises GDP somewhat, at least in the next 30 years or so. There's some improvement in GDP, but it's not as much as it would be if you had a closed economy. And here people start to save more, but a lot of their savings goes abroad because we have a global capital market. So there's, in an open economy like this, things that change your saving rate a lot don't change the amount of capital that's working in your country, because capital comes in from abroad or leaves your country to keep the wage very much similar to what it is abroad. The next two things are, what about a fertility increase? What if we could get Russian fertility to increase by 25%? How would you do that? Well, Vladimir Putin has a discussion with the Russian men, takes them into a separate room and says, do your job, or whatever. Or then he has a discussion with Russian women, do your job. Everybody should increase their fertility who's able to by 25%, so we have more kids. And, or some other mechanism. I don't know how it would happen. Maybe a huge subsidy financed by some other tax. But if we did that, Russian GDP ends up in the long run, a whole lot higher than it would otherwise be. Because you have a lot more Russian people under this policy in the long run than would otherwise be the case. So we're talking about increasing fertility through 2058 and then stabilizing birth. So you end up stabilizing the population at a much higher level, much larger level. And the last thing is simulating all these policies, these three policies, in this context of a price shock, a permanent price shock. And you see that the economy ends up doing much better in terms of size of GDP, even though there are this big price shock, because these other factors come into play. They outweigh the loss of oil revenues. Oops. So the bottom line here is that Russia has some options for reform, pension reform, fertility policy, corporate tax reform, that could more than offset any permanent reduction in the price of oil in terms of the long-run picture. The government is not considering doing this. I've talked to nobody in the government about this. I don't think there's any reason to believe the government is thinking about these policies. I don't want anybody, if anybody's from the press, to suggest that, or to think, come away from this session to thinking that I have talked, anybody in the government has been talking to me about this, or that I've talked to anybody in the government about it. Absolutely not. Or that the Gaidar Institute has been, I just presented these results on Friday to the people at the Gaidar Institute, apart from the researchers there that I've been working with. This is the first time they've heard about this. So this is purely hypothetical. It's just to say that there are things that countries can do to deal with their transition. And the biggest factor in Russia's transition is its demographics, in terms of its place in the world, in terms of its the size of its GDP. I think it's responsible right now in this model for about 5% of global GDP. I think it goes down to about 3% of global GDP in the baseline simulation. And again, it becomes a world dominated by India and China through time. So let me stop there and see if you have any questions.
In the very beginning, you said it's a partial equilibrium model.
No, this is fully general equilibrium.
Okay, sorry, just haven't started.
Everything's fully general equilibrium. Wages and interest rates are fully endogenously determined. Capital's moving to equate after corporate tax returns to in each country in every period. So you've got current account deficits and surpluses floating around behind the scene here. And wages are changing through time.
Can you please go back to the table
2? Sure. Table 2 would be the 2 is the right. Okay.
I might be thinking wrong here, but what I understand is that people who are in 0 and 9 in 15 years they will be 59, and looking at Russia's forecasts, they will be like moving from 9.5 to 14.68. If I can see correct. Is that like immigration? Is that?
Well, there is immigration here based on, and there's an age distribution of the immigrants. So that's part of the story, but.
Because we don't see this in the United States case, like whether the death rate in the United States is higher or there's more immigration in Russia.
Well, the death rate in Russia is higher, and indeed we can't do a great job replicating your age distribution of older people. We have somewhat too many older Russians, because relative to we don't let anybody die before 68. You have a lot of Russians who die before 68, disproportionately high. So if there's one weak place in this model in terms of the demographics, it's on Russia's aging. We may be overstating the aging. On the other hand, your life expectancy has gone down. There's reason to think it would go back up to where it was before during Soviet times, right? I don't know that there's any reason to think that Russia should permanently have a lower life expectancy. Something should turn around there. But I'm not sure I've answered your question.
No, I was just thinking, like, you said that immigration in the United States is a big problem, that they are not yet thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what I see from the picture is that, according to this forecast, Russia should be receiving a lot of immigrants in about 50 years.
Well, yeah, we could assume that, and that would turn things around. And Russia potentially has that option if the immigrants would come in. But we're looking at Rostat's projections of immigration and the UN's projections. They're basically projecting pretty high immigration, but then a decline in immigration rates after like 2030, if I remember correctly. I may have this wrong. And that's the UN at least. I think Rostat is assuming immigration continues. And we're not assuming immigration falls in the model. We're basically using Rostat's immigration assumptions and keeping them fixed through time after 2058. So we're sticking with the Russian government's projections of immigration rates. The big thing in the US is that we have quite high fertility plus really high immigration. You have relatively high immigration and quite low fertility. And that makes a big difference. And it's...
And, well, I just wondered, you said you didn't speak much to the government about that, but how...
I didn't just at all. I haven't discussed anything with anybody in the government since coming to Russia 3 years ago.
Do you think there will be an interest in all that?
I think that people in the government have seen the Fiscal Gap study. I don't know for sure. I think they may... the head of the... Alexei Kudrin, was interested in the findings of both of these studies. I know he interacts with people in the government. He may have or may not have conveyed this to the government, but I just don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty much sure that he will be interested in that, but he's no longer in the government. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well, this Fiscal Gap study was published in the NBR, and it was made news. It was picked up by The Economist and the Financial Times. So members of the government that are looking at those publications presumably saw the findings of the study, and a lot of people thought that the study was ridiculous because we're going out to the infinite horizon. But again, when you discount things way out in the future, they have a very small present value. And there's no way around doing this right. Any finite horizon fiscal gap is going to be arbitrary. I can produce, by choice of words, any finite horizon fiscal gap. So that's why the European Commission, even though they put out a 50-year fiscal gap, they also put out an infinite horizon fiscal gap, because maybe they understand at this point that that's the only one that's well defined. So the press, at least, they wrote about the fiscal gap study when we delivered this over a year and a half ago. When this paper gets released, which I hope it will be, I expect they will, oops, sorry, I think I'll have to turn that one off. I believe they will there may be some interest by the press and maybe by the government in these findings. But they complement each other. And maybe the picture here is a little less bad for Russia than the fiscal gap picture, because here we're taking into account productivity catch-up, which we're not in the fiscal gap study. And that's a big deal, because Russia's productivity is roughly about a third of the US productivity if you look at per capita GDP levels. I don't quite get it, because I think Russians are very productive, but maybe I'm seeing a select sample.
No, but I found
Yeah.
the kind of idea or the information very interesting. That if you start comparing younger people at 21 years old, thinking that the productivity gap in that cohort is actually narrowing down, then, well, I mean, if you rely on this information, probably you do sit and do nothing until like much later, and then like everything automatically will come into some sort of.
Yeah, so we should probably simulate this with no catch-up, see what happens, and that's the next thing we can do. I think we should also add a uncovered sector. And by the way, the code for this program is freely available. Anybody wants to work on this model in whatever direction they'd like, we're making the code available to any economist who wants to use it. And another thing I'm doing with some people at GuideR and with Jeffrey Sachs is to add a real energy sector here where we have the production of fossil fuels at increasing costs, and we have the production of clean energy at, through time, decreasing costs due to technological change and government investment. And we have a clear externality. We're going to have a temperature model where the fossil fuels will affect temperature, and that's going to affect climate change. That's going to affect output. It's going to degrade output. It's going to also affect people directly in terms of the utility, because more pollution means, you know, more particulates that people are breathing. And you can see that in spades if you go to Shanghai or Beijing, where it's almost impossible to, you know, for me at least, I come back not feeling so good after just a few days in Beijing. So we're going to include the externality here, and then look at things like carbon taxes and ask, look, if you have a carbon tax, let's say it's a universal across all countries carbon tax, will it matter to climate change? How high can the carbon tax be such that we can have a Pareto path where we leave future generations to pay the bill for the any injury to current generations from having to pay the carbon tax, but they're better off, they have to pay higher taxes. So let's say we put on a carbon tax, but we compensate current generations for having to pay it in some other manner, okay? So there's an incentive not to use carbon. And then in the future, maybe we borrow money, just to use that language, to make subsidies, and we leave the debt to be paid back by future generations. They're worse off because of that, but they're better off because the climate's better. We can find out how high the carbon tax can be such that we still have a Pareto path. So we can get optimal environmental policy as a solution to the externality. That's a scientific answer. Right now, what's going on is that we have these single agent models where we're assuming that people are altruistic. You wonder if they're altruistic, why they would be trying to kill the environment, right? That's an important question. Why would you have a model where people are altruistic towards their future generations and nonetheless they're trying to kill the environment, kill the climate? But leave that aside. In those models, which like the Stern report and other economists have used, there's a view to be a social planner who is like God, who comes in and has his morality and decides what's the optimal path of degradation of the environment. What's the optimal climate policy? And it's all based on religion. There's no science there whatsoever. If I say the time preference rate should be this, the social planner should have these preferences, I get one answer. If Nick Stern, who wrote that report, says it should be this, then Nick's God. If I say it should be a different time preference rate, I'm playing God. That's not doing economics. Economics is, hey, we got a problem here. We got a market failure. We have an externality. What's it take to correct it? And that's what we need to do. Correct it so that nobody's worse off, so that it's a win-win solution. And that's what we'll be able to do with this model, hopefully within 6 to 12 months, because we're going to expand it to include that.